She was standing on the porch of her childhood home, suitcase in one hand, a folder of marine research in the other. The salty Washington air she loved so much stung her lungs, but not because of the cold. It was because of the bright red foreclosure notice taped to the door. The neighbors stared, whispering. Some shook their heads, some avoided her eyes. And in that moment, after 18 months studying deep-sea life in waters most people will never dare sail, she realized her own life had been hijacked on dry land. Her sister, the one who promised to take care of things while she was away, had mortgaged and sold the house, their inherited home, sitting on a federally protected marine habitat. And she hadn't just done it quietly. No, she bragged. She laughed at the good deal she struck. She even had the audacity to say, "Don't worry, sis. You can crash with me for a while." That slap? Oh, it wasn't just a reaction, it was history snapping in half. But here's the twist. She didn't burn bridges. She didn't scream or stage a dramatic scene. She simply walked away, suitcase still in hand, and called one name, her lawyer friend. Because sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it comes dressed in silence, wearing a suit, carrying a stack of legal documents. Now, before we dive into how one sister's greed became her trap and how a marine researcher with nothing but patience and persistence gave her no way out, let's rewind. Who was she before the foreclosure notice? What kind of woman spends months braving storms, loneliness, and the unknown depths of the Pacific, only to return home to betrayal? Her name was Claire Bennett. She wasn't a celebrity or a billionaire. She was a woman who loved the sea more than comfort, who studied coral reefs when her friends were busy posting brunch selfies. She was steady, resilient, sometimes stubborn, and had a heart that believed family ties were unbreakable. Spoiler alert, she was wrong. This isn't just a story about a house. It's a story about dignity, justice, and the kind of revenge that doesn't come with fire or fists, but with patience, paperwork, and perfect timing. And trust me, you'll want to know exactly how her sister's empire crumbled, piece by piece, until even the neighbors who once whispered stood in stunned silence. So, welcome story lovers. From where are you watching? Drop your city name in the comments so we can see how far our story travels. Claire Bennett wasn't always the woman standing on the porch with a foreclosure notice in her face. No, she was once the girl with a notebook full of sketches of sea creatures, who spent summers catching starfish along the Washington coast while her friends begged their parents for trips to Disneyland. Her childhood was not perfect, but it was hers. The house, the one that later became the center of betrayal, wasn't just four walls. It was a living memory. Her father, a fisherman with calloused hands and weather-worn skin, built much of it with his own labor. Her mother, a school librarian, filled it with books that smelled of ink and old dreams. It was the kind of house where the floor creaked, where every corner told a story, where the ocean breeze slipped through open windows at night like a lullaby. But like many families, storms came. Her father passed away when Claire was in high school. One moment he was telling fishing stories at the dinner table, the next he was gone, heart failure. The silence that followed was the kind that swallows laughter whole. Her mother never remarried, never stopped working, but the light in her eyes dimmed with each year. Claire and her sister, Emily, were supposed to share the burden. But Emily was different, glamorous, restless, addicted to the idea of a bigger life. Where Claire found wonder in tide pools, Emily found boredom. Where Claire studied for biology exams, Emily studied fashion magazines. Still, Claire carried the weight. She got a scholarship to study marine biology, clawing her way through classes while working late shifts at a diner. She never complained, not once. Instead, she saved every tip she earned, even when her shoes had holes in the soles. She graduated near the top of her class, but not without scars. There were nights she cried in the campus bathroom, too embarrassed to admit she hadn't eaten in a day. There were mornings she walked into lectures with swollen eyes because she'd been up all night helping her mother manage bills. And there were countless times she almost quit, but she didn't. Dreams, though, don't always bloom in straight lines. Claire wanted to dive into research immediately to work on saving fragile marine habitats. Instead, she was pulled back home, taking jobs that paid little but allowed her to stay close. She postponed her master's program twice, first when her mother's health declined, and again when Emily declared she was moving to the city to find herself, leaving the caregiving squarely on Claire's shoulders. She didn't resent it, at least not then. Love has a way of disguising sacrifice as duty. The breaking point came quietly. Bills stacked higher than the books on her mother's shelves. Medical expenses drained every ounce of savings. And when her mother finally passed away, Claire stood at the funeral with one thought pressing against her chest. Now it's just me. Just me and Emily. That house by the water became more than property. It was the last tangible piece of family. The last echo of her father's laughter, her mother's quiet strength. Claire promised herself she'd protect it no matter what. But survival has sharp edges. Claire picked up contract jobs on research boats, some lasting weeks, some months. She'd come back sunburned, exhausted, but with just enough money to keep the house afloat. She skipped vacations, skipped luxuries, skipped even fixing her own car until it broke down completely. Small acts of survival stacked up like bricks, learning how to stretch rice and beans into a week's worth of meals, mending the same coat 3 winters in a row, tutoring kids in science just to cover utility bills. She knew sacrifice by name. It was stitched into every corner of her life. And still, through it all, Claire dreamed. She dreamed of completing her research, of publishing studies that could change the way policymakers viewed fragile ocean ecosystems. She dreamed of teaching future scientists, of making her parents proud, but every dream felt like it had to wait its turn. Emily, meanwhile, floated in and out of Claire's life like a shadow. Sometimes broke, sometimes thriving, always chasing some new scheme. She'd borrow money and forget to pay it back. She'd promise to help, then vanish. Claire excused it for years, believing her sister just needed time to grow up. That illusion shattered the day Claire returned from an expedition to find the foreclosure notice. Because here's the thing, Claire wasn't naive. She'd survived storms bigger than most people could imagine. She knew hardship, hunger, and heartbreak. But betrayal? Betrayal from the one person she trusted to protect the only piece of family they had left? That was different. It wasn't just a house that was sold. It was her history, her sacrifices, her parents' memory. And in that moment, the weight of every past struggle pressed down on her chest. But instead of breaking, Claire did what she always did. She stood still. She inhaled the salt air. She let the hurt wash over her like a tide. And then she decided, this time, she wasn't just going to survive. This time, she was going to fight back. Claire thought she'd seen the worst the world had to offer. She had faced 30-foot waves in the North Pacific, endured months of isolation with nothing but her research journals for company, and patched a leaking boat in the middle of a storm with duct tape and sheer willpower. But nothing prepared her for the betrayal waiting in her own bloodline. When she called Emily after finding the foreclosure notice, she half expected tears, excuses, maybe even an apology. What she got instead was laughter. "Oh, Claire, don't be so dramatic. You're never here anyway. You're always off with your little fish. I handled it." Think of it as simplifying. That was the word Emily used for selling off their inheritance to shady developers who promised her a quick payout. Claire could have yelled, could have cursed, but something inside her shifted in that moment. Instead of erupting, she went quiet. And quiet, for Claire, was never a sign of surrender. It was the sign of a storm forming. That night, she called Daniel. He wasn't just any friend. He was a lawyer she'd met years ago when giving a lecture at a university coastal policy conference. Daniel had sharp eyes, a sharper tongue, and the kind of integrity that made enemies in the courtroom. When Claire explained, he didn't waste words. He just said, "Send me everything. Every document, every notice. Don't talk to Emily. Don't confront her again. Let's see how deep this goes." And deep it went. Within days, Daniel uncovered something shocking. Not only had Emily mortgaged the house illegally, without Claire's consent as co-owner, but she had done so by falsifying Claire's signature. Forgery, wire fraud, mortgage fraud. A trifecta of disaster wrapped in arrogance. Claire felt her stomach sink, but Daniel just leaned back and said, "She dug her own hole. You don't need to bury her. The law will do that." Still, there were risks. Going public could mean years of legal battles. Developers with powerful backers could retaliate. Emily could spin the narrative, painting Claire as the absent sister who abandoned the family home while chasing her selfish dreams at sea. And part of that stung because there was truth in it. Claire had left. She had spent years away, immersed in her passion, while Emily was left to pretend she was the caretaker. The guilt tangled with the rage until Claire wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal or the reflection it forced her to face. But then came the discovery that erased every shred of doubt. While combing through the foreclosure file, Claire noticed something strange. The developers weren't just after the house. They were after the land, a rare slice of waterfront designated as part of a federally protected marine habitat. Selling it wasn't just shady, it was potentially illegal on multiple levels. If built on, the consequences could devastate local ecosystems. Suddenly, this wasn't just about a stolen home. It was about everything Claire had dedicated her life to protecting, and that's when the fire lit inside her. This wasn't going to be a quiet family dispute anymore. It was going to be war. She and Daniel began documenting everything. Copies of forged papers, emails Emily had carelessly sent bragging about finally cashing in, even a recorded voicemail where Emily said, "Claire won't stop me this time. She's too busy swimming with whales." Claire saved every shred of evidence, filing them into neat folders, labeling each with precision. It was almost comical. The same meticulousness she used cataloging coral species now turned toward dismantling her sister's scheme. But war, even silent war, carries risks. There were nights she lay awake wondering, am I really ready to destroy my own sister? The girl she once shared bunk beds with, whispered secrets with, made paper boats with on the shoreline? Could she really drag Emily into court, knowing the fallout could fracture what little family remained? The answer came one morning when she visited the shoreline near the house. Construction stakes were already hammered into the sand. Bright orange flags flapped in the breeze, marking where developers planned to dig. She knelt down, touching the damp earth, imagining bulldozers tearing through seagrass beds that nurtured young salmon. It wasn't just personal anymore. It was ethical. Emily hadn't just stolen from Claire. She had sold out the very ocean their father taught them to respect. And that was unforgivable. The stakes were now higher than Claire ever imagined. It wasn't just about her dignity or her inheritance. It was about legacy, justice, and protecting something fragile that couldn't speak for itself. Daniel filed the first lawsuit, a civil action for fraud and restitution. But that was just the beginning. He also tipped off federal regulators, environmental agencies, and even local media. It was a calculated gamble. By exposing the deal's illegality, Claire risked becoming the center of a scandal that could drag her through months, maybe years, of scrutiny. But she was ready, because sometimes survival means silence, and sometimes survival means stepping into the storm and daring it to break around you. Claire had spent her whole life enduring waves. Now, she was about to make some of her own. The mahogany-paneled boardroom was designed to intimidate, the kind of place where the air felt thick with wealth and arrogance. Framed stock certificates hung on the walls like trophies, while a long glass table reflected the smug faces of men who thought they controlled everything. Ruth had never set foot in this room before, at least not as anything more than the silent shadow-cleaning crumbs after their catered lunches. But today was different. Today she wasn't holding a mop. Today she carried only a worn folder and a quiet fire inside her chest. The CFO was the first to notice her standing by the door. He adjusted his silk tie and barked, "Excuse me, this is a closed meeting. Staff aren't permitted here." Laughter rippled around the table. The CEO barely looked up from his papers, his tone dripping with condescension. "Ruth, isn't it? You're lost. The janitor's closet is 2 floors down." They expected her to blush, stammer, maybe scurry away in embarrassment. That's what people like her always did in their world, fade into the wallpaper. But Ruth didn't move. Instead, she placed the folder on the polished glass table with a deliberate calm. The sound of paper sliding against glass cut through the chuckles like a blade. "You might want to look at this," she said, her voice steady but sharp. The room stilled, confusion flickering across a dozen expensive watches and tailored suits. The CFO frowned, opening the folder. His face drained of color as he scanned the pages. Columns of numbers, spreadsheets annotated with a cleaner's scrawled notes, bank transfers highlighted in yellow. "What is this?" he stammered. "It's your missing $4.2 million, Ruth replied. "And every falsified entry you tried to bury in the quarterly reports." The CEO finally looked up. His smile was tight, rehearsed, but his eyes were wary. "Ruth, these are serious accusations." "You don't understand corporate accounting." "I understand theft," Ruth cut in louder this time. The words echoed off the walls, and for once nobody laughed. She leaned forward, placing one calloused finger on the page. "This transaction here? To an offshore account under your cousin's name. And this? Kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. You thought no one would notice." "But I did. While you were busy pretending I didn't exist, I was watching." Gasps rippled. The head of legal shifted uncomfortably, whispering something to the CFO. The CEO's mask began to crack. "This is absurd. Do you have any idea the damage you're causing? You're jeopardizing thousands of jobs." "No," Ruth said, her voice low and cutting. "You jeopardized them the day you chose greed over integrity." She straightened, pulling another sheet from her folder, a napkin, creased and worn, with numbers scribbled in pen. It looked laughably out of place in a boardroom worth millions. Yet it held more power than any stock certificate on the wall. "This," Ruth said, holding it up, "is where it started. I sent copies to the IRS, the SEC, and to Channel 7. By the time you finish your little damage control speech, the world will already know." The room froze. Every face turned pale, as if the oxygen had been sucked out. Phones buzzed silently against suit pockets. One board member pushed back his chair, muttering, "She's telling the truth." "We're finished." The CFO slammed a fist on the table. "You insolent!" But his rage only made him look small. Ruth didn't flinch. She'd faced worse tempers in her life, drunken uncles, cruel supervisors, nights when bills outweighed paychecks. This was nothing compared to those storms. For the first time, she wasn't cleaning up someone else's mess. She was exposing it. The CEO tried one last tactic, his voice suddenly soft, almost paternal. "Ruth, think carefully. We can make this worth your while. A promotion, money, security for your family. You don't need to throw your life away over this." Ruth met his gaze, unblinking. "I don't want your hush money. I want justice." Silence. Heavy. Unbreakable. Then she turned, heading toward the door. Her shoes clicked against the marble floor, each step louder than the last. At the threshold, she paused, glancing back only once. "Funny thing," she said, almost to herself. "All those years you didn't even notice me sweeping your floors. But today, I'm the one sweeping you out of power." And with that, she left. Behind her, the boardroom erupted, angry shouts, frantic calls, the sound of empires collapsing. But Ruth didn't need to hear it. She already knew. In that single moment, she had transformed from invisible janitor to the most powerful person in the room. The strange thing about revenge is that it never feels the way movies promise it will. It isn't a roaring victory or a champagne toast. Sometimes it's quieter, like the tide pulling out after a storm, leaving behind wreckage you never asked for, but now must walk across. That was the reality for Claire. When the legal dust settled, her sister Melissa was no longer the self-assured, sharp-tongued woman who once bragged about doing what had to be done. She was drowning in lawsuits, regulatory probes, and frozen bank accounts. The once glittering image of Melissa, the ambitious socialite with business connections, had shattered into a woman spending her days in and out of courthouses, dodging creditors, and whispering apologies no one believed anymore. Claire didn't celebrate her downfall. She didn't need to. Justice had already done its work. The restitution order was massive. The mortgage company that had enabled the illegal transaction was held accountable. Federal regulators, alerted to the violation of protected marine land, added layers of penalties Melissa could never hope to pay off. Every signature Melissa had scribbled in arrogance had become the chain dragging her down. For Claire, redemption didn't come with Melissa's ruin. It came with reclaiming her dignity and the home that had been more than just walls and a roof. That waterfront house, surrounded by fragile marine life, wasn't just real estate. It was the last gift of her parents, the place where childhood laughter still echoed in her memory. Walking back inside after months of fighting in courtrooms, Claire felt the silence of the house press against her chest. It was as if the home had been waiting patiently for her return. But here's the part most people didn't expect. Claire didn't stay. She had dreamed of returning, sitting on the porch watching the tides, perhaps writing a book about her 18-month marine research expedition. But after everything, she realized something powerful. The house had been her anchor, but it wasn't her future. So Claire made a bold choice. She turned the property into a marine research and education center. Instead of letting it sit as a monument to family betrayal, she opened it to students, environmentalists, and young researchers who couldn't afford access to such resources. She partnered with her lawyer friend, Daniel, and together they created a nonprofit that ran workshops, coastal cleanups, and marine life conservation projects. The once private home became a lighthouse of sorts, not flashing beams into the ocean, but shining opportunity into young lives. School children came to touch tide pools, college students conducted field research, and families learned why protecting the marine ecosystem mattered. Claire had found her healing in giving the home a new purpose. As for her personal life, the transformation was even deeper. For years, Claire had been the quiet one, the dutiful sister, the dreamer who went off to study the ocean while everyone else stayed behind chasing money and appearances. After the betrayal, she stopped apologizing for being different. She embraced it. The ocean had taught her resilience, patience, and the beauty of silence, and now she lived by those lessons on land. Her colleagues respected her not just for her research, but for her courage. News of the family dispute and her eventual triumph spread in local papers, even catching the attention of national outlets that framed it as the scientist who fought greed with justice. Invitations poured in for conferences and talks, not just about marine life, but about integrity, environmental law, and personal perseverance. Her community rallied too. Neighbors who once stayed silent about Melissa's arrogance now looked at Claire with admiration. They brought flowers when the center opened, volunteered for events, and supported her mission. And perhaps the most healing moment came when her estranged uncle, once a skeptic of Claire's career, stood at the opening ceremony and said quietly, "Your parents would be proud. Claire didn't need revenge anymore. She had something better, renewal, and Melissa?" She faded into the background, a cautionary tale whispered about in family circles. Her downfall wasn't Claire's doing alone. It was her own greed that had built the trap she fell into. Claire didn't reach down to pull her out, nor did she push her further. She simply walked away and chose to live differently. The contrast between the sisters was stark. Melissa had tried to cash in on a house for short-term gain and lost everything. Claire had nearly lost the same house, but instead, she turned it into a legacy. Years later, when Claire stood on the porch as the sun dipped low, casting orange ripples across the water, she didn't see betrayal anymore. She saw waves carrying the promise of new beginnings. She saw children laughing on the shore where she once played with Melissa. And she realized that forgiveness didn't always mean letting someone back into your life. It sometimes meant letting them go and no longer carrying their shadow. That was Claire's redemption. Not the legal victory, not the applause from the community, but the quiet peace of knowing she had chosen creation over destruction, purpose over pain, and perhaps the most poetic part. The house, once nearly stolen, became the very thing that multiplied its worth, not in dollars, but in impact. So what's the lesson here, story lovers? That sometimes revenge doesn't roar, it whispers. That family doesn't always mean loyalty. And that the best way to rise above betrayal is not by burning what's left, but by building something new on its ashes. Claire's story reminds us that justice may come with a gavel, but redemption comes with what we choose to do afterward. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories every day. They once called Claire the quiet sister, the one who spent more time studying fish than attending parties, the one who preferred tide charts to shopping malls, the one who, in her family's eyes, was too soft, too naive to handle the real world. But here's the truth. She wasn't soft. She was steady. She wasn't naive. She was patient. And the ocean she loved so much had been teaching her lessons all along, because waves don't crash every second. They wait. They build, they gather strength, and when the moment comes, they break with a force no one can stop. That was Claire. Silent, steady, until it was time. Her sister thought she had the upper hand. She thought greed was clever, that betrayal was permanent, that blood ties could be twisted without consequence. But she forgot one thing. When you sell someone's dignity, you've already signed your own downfall. And Claire? She didn't have to scream. She didn't have to beg. She simply let the law, the truth, and time itself do the work. Her sister lost her reputation, her career, her friends, even her financial freedom. Claire lost something too, trust, and a piece of the family she once cherished. But in return, she gained something far greater, peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you didn't just survive betrayal, you rose above it. And here's the twist most people don't know. Claire never kept that victory just for herself. Months later, she began volunteering with young women in coastal communities, mentoring them, teaching them about marine research, and about protecting what's theirs, whether it's a coral reef or their own future. One of those girls? She recently won a state scholarship, crediting Claire for helping her believe she belonged in science. So tell me, story lovers, what defines a legacy? Is it the house you inherit or the strength you pass on? Is it the money someone steals or the dignity they can never take away? Because sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone else. It's about rebuilding yourself so powerfully that their betrayal becomes nothing more than a cautionary tale. Claire's sister wrote her own ruin with greed. Claire wrote her redemption with patience. And now every wave outside her window reminds her of this. Justice, like the tide, always returns. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and new videos.